Hello to all the listeners of the Right Mind podcast, a podcast produced by the Institute of European Right, a think tank based in Vilnius. My name is Teodoras Žukas, and together in our studio is with us Laurynas Pilurtis, my colleague. Hello, Laurynas.
Hello.
And immediately I would like to introduce our guest, our today's guest for our podcast, Mr. James J. Carafano. Hello.
It's good to be with you.
Thank you. James J. Carafano is a senior counsel to the president and Richardson Fellow at Heritage Foundation. Mr. Carafano is an expert in national security and foreign policy. He has previously served as the vice president of the Heritage Catherine and Shelby Colton Davis Institute for National Security and Foreign Policy. Besides that, Mr. Carafano is a prolific writer and researcher and has authored many publications and books that we will definitely, hopefully, touch upon in today's conversation. Well, Mr. Carafano, first question is about we are in Vilnius in the end of March. What are your impressions being just landed in Vilnius? It's not your first time in Vilnius. What are your thoughts?
It's not, but so you didn't mention, I was in the Army for 25 years, and much of that was during the Cold War. And I actually had two tours in Germany, and I was in Germany the day the wall came down. Matter of fact, we were actually in the field doing military maneuvers, and we had these big computer screens, and you had all the little computer dots that were the NATO, and you had the little computer dots that were the Warsaw Pact. And I remember looking up on one screen, and there was this, the red dots fighting the blue dots, and on the other screen there was these pictures of these guys beating on the wall with hammers, and I thought, this is, I never thought I'd see this. Several years later, I remember being in Berlin, and at the point where you can't really distinguish between East and West Berlin anymore, and kind of standing at Checkpoint Charlie and just watching tourists walk by, and I go, and just almost crying, thinking, do they have no idea what this means to just be able to walk across the street, right? Or walk through the Brandenburg Gate. And every time I come to, Vilnius or Riga or Tallinn, these are streets I never thought I would walk in my lifetime. And so on the one hand, honestly, there's this, every time I come to the Baltic countries, there's this kind of incredible joy that I get in my heart. But the other thing, now to look at what's going on today when you come here, all people want to talk about is how do we know we can have a free life in the future? I'm worrying about Russia again. It's incredibly sad to think that, again, in my lifetime, that people are worried about that, today they're living perfectly fine. Tomorrow, their neighborhood could look like Beirut or Bucha. Yeah, it's always mixed feelings.
Okay. We'll talk about these security in the present situation in this region's security. What I would like to start with is of your evaluation of the current administration's foreign policy. We talk a lot in Lithuania about Washington and about what this administration and the Congress should do, ought to do, and what can we do to make some things happen in Washington. What would be your evaluation of the main foreign policy failures of this Biden's administration? But both, I would like to ask you to point out at least a couple of achievements in your view.
Yeah, so we'll kind of run around the world, I think, because U.S. is a global power with global interests and global responsibilities. So it's very difficult to talk about foreign policy and not really have to touch on all the parts of the world that touch on U.S. interests. There are good things. And I come at this from a completely nonpartisan perspective. In the United States, we have, Republicans and Democrats. I'm actually not a Republican or a Democrat. I'm an independent voter. I work in a nonpartisan think tank. And so if I say things that are critical, it's not because I have a political agenda. Didn't serve in the last government, won't serve in the next one if a Republican wins. There are some good things going on in the world, particularly if you look in Asia, where many of the U.S. alliance relationships are stronger with India, Japan, Korea, and the United States, Australia, the Philippines. There's a common thread to all of it. Where things are going well for the administration, it's largely because our allies are pulling them forward to do good things. The Indo-Pacific is a really good example. The Indians are proactive, the Japanese, the Koreans, the Philippines, the Australians. And so that's where good things happen. You know, in contrast, the reason why this administration struggles so much is because in many ways, it's a continuation of the Obama administration. It's many of the same people doing many of the same things. And if you look at it from an adversarial perspective, it's like you're starting a game and the other guy's got your game plan. They know exactly what they're going to do. And it's very, very predictable what they're going to do because it's exactly what the Obama did, people. So we'll start in Europe because it's closest to home. Look, I have to be honest. Biden has always started indifferent about Europe. His notion is really to go to Brussels and Paris and Berlin and talk to them and say, okay, you guys do what you want, and that's it. I do put a lot of the responsibility for the outbreak of the war on the administration, who I thought were very feckless in showing a strong deterrent to Putin. I mean, the things that they put on the table to deter Putin really, I think, did the opposite. Did the opposite. They're almost meaningless because in many ways there was almost a green light because they were so ineffectual as an actual deterrent. And then, of course, the president's very first impulse was to offer the president a taxi ride out of the country. I think it's a good example. The reason why the U.S. has actually been forward-leaning in Ukraine was because the Ukrainians fought and because Europeans supported them. And the administration really, I don't think, really had a choice. But I never thought his heart was in this. So I don't really think they have a coherent path of the way forward. If you go to the Middle East, I mean, I always argued that the Middle East was going to be the most troubled place for the U.S. because essentially they took what was a successful policy at the Abraham Accords, really promoting Arab-Israeli normalization and containing Iran, and they essentially flipped it on its head. They tried to engage with Iran, and they really put no energy behind the Abraham Accords, and there's the result of regions really kind of blown up in their face. So that's a disaster. Africa is a disaster. They don't have a coherent strategy for Africa at all. And it's not just kind of Chinese influence, Russian influence in Africa, as everybody points to. Look, there's going to be 500 million additional people in Africa. It doesn't matter if you care about Africa or not. That is going to change the face of the world for good or for ill. So one of the fastest growing places on earth. So not having a coherent approach to Africa just makes no sense. Closer to home in Latin America, people, I think, look at our border, which is literally the only developed country in the world which has a completely open border. We're now having illegal migration from all over the planet. Every single migrant trail is being reoriented towards the United States. We have travel agencies in Africa and the Middle East and China where you can book your illegal entry into the United States. But the border is kind of symbolic of a larger problem. We have a major Chinese influence, Russian influence, Iranian influence, destabilizing influences in the region. It really is a really significant challenge for the United States. And the administration is completely indifferent to all that. So it's difficult. It is difficult to look around the world and say there's a part of the world that's more stable and more prosperous as a result of this administration's policy, because there isn't.
Well, that's the bad news, but are there any kind of opportunities, sort of in the near future or sort of midterm? Because when we look, the Chinese influence, the Russian influence, all the sort of a coalition basically of authoritarian regimes is forming.
Yeah.
Their interests do not align completely, but they're finding more common ground, which is a danger. And sort of to counteract that, what are the possible opportunities? What we, as the allies to the United States, do, and also maybe encourage people in Washington to think about what could be done on these various problems. Because, Lithuania has Russia as a neighbor, basically from two sides. One, the Kaliningrad Oblast, and the other side is basically right. Belarus, which is occupied by Kremlin. But also we have a strained relationship with China because we started engaging with Taiwan and so on. And we are here sort of thinking, the U.S. has clearly outlined that we should open up relations with Taiwan, be more careful towards China. I think it's a prudent thing, but what else could the U.S. allies help the U.S. do?
Actually, there are enormous opportunities. And I got to be honest with you, I'm an optimist. I think military people are optimists because oftentimes we're in some of the most horrible, terrible situations and everything looks doom and gloom. And what alternative do you have but say, well, okay, we have to move forward. What can we do to move forward? So there are four, and they deal with three parts of the world, which are particularly important to the United States as a global power with global interests and responsibilities. At the core of American foreign policy, whether it's Republican or Democrat, doesn't really matter. There are three really important parts of the world. They're really indispensable, and they are Western Europe, the Middle East, and the Indo-Pacific. Well, why those three? It's because really they are the world's three great lily pads that kind of tie the world together. And if you're a global power with global interests and global responsibilities to get around the world, you would like these parts of the world to be stable and relatively peaceful and prosperous. It doesn't have to be the land of milk and honey. They can have an occasional war, but American foreign policy is infinitely easier if we have the confidence that we can connect with key parts of the world that will allow us to essentially address our challenge in whatever region they are. So there's enormous opportunity in all three places. Asia's quite honestly, the easiest because the Chinese have been so aggressive that people have really woken up the closer you get to China about the need to contain China's malicious growth. And they all look to the United States to do that. So, we talk about the Quad, for example, which is, Japan, the US, Australia, India working together. I mean, that has grown enormously. It's actually a project in many ways started at my think tank where we worked a lot on promoting the idea of the Quad. And then the Trump administration and the Abe, government really picked up on this idea. It's actually been quite successful. So there's a lot of potential there. If you look at things like AUKUS, for example, with the U.S. and Australia and Britain working together, a submarine program, I think we get the China challenge in the Pacific from a geostrategic standpoint, and people are moving in the right direction. So actually, that's an area where I feel the most confident. The Middle East, there's enormous opportunity there. All we've got to do is flip the script. If we go back to containing Iran and not empowering Iran and really promoting the normalization of Israeli-Arab relationships, I think we can get that region back on track. And honestly, I think we have an enormous opportunity in Western Europe. I am not the doom and gloom guy. There's only two great dangers to the stability and prosperity of Europe, and that is the destabilizing influence of Russia, often supported and encouraged by the Chinese, and the problems of Africa and the Middle East kind of overflowing into Western Europe. Look, Europe cannot deal with either of those problems. There isn't capacity if you put every European nation together. But together, the United States and Europe can. So if the U.S. goes back to being the leader of the Middle East, that really takes the Africa problem off and the Middle East problem off the table. Limiting Russia's ability to destabilize the West, we have an enormous opportunity to do that. And one is a free and independent Ukraine, which I think is going to happen. But you've also added 1,000 miles to the NATO frontier. So now if Russia wants to come at the West, it's got 1,000 miles of additional front to worry about. And on the other flank, you'll have probably the two largest and most powerful armies in Europe, which will be a Ukrainian army and a Polish army. And I also think conventional deterrence against Russia, the Ukrainian war is the lesson on how to do that. It's going to be on deep strike. It's not going to be by putting millions of divisions on the front line or putting minefields around the Slovakia Gap. We're going to develop deep strike capabilities to kill Russian stuff before it even gets to the border. And we're going to deploy more missile and air defense systems to protect our cities. That's the way forward. It's very achievable. It's very doable. Together, the U.S. and I can do that together. I think we can take the Russian conventional threat off the table for a generation. So this gets me to the fourth thing, because if you have a stable Europe and a stable Middle East and partnerships in the Indo-Pacific. There's a lot of opportunities to knit all this together, particularly as we see the kind of the collapse of the post-Soviet space and the Russians really losing their influence, not just in Western Europe, but in Central Asia and the Caucasus and elsewhere. And I think people don't really realize this opportunity because they don't conceptually, we don't think Eurasia as an integrated space because we're so used to thinking it as, one side's on one sphere and one side's on the other. But the reality is with the collapse of the post-Soviet space, there's this opportunity to really knit projects together that people are working on. So one that you guys are obviously really familiar with is the 3 Cs initiative, right? And forget about the fund but think about just the idea of the 3 Cs, about building north-south infrastructure across northern, central, and southern Europe. That's a really powerful idea because that essentially is the new economic backbone Europe. It also has a security dimension because it also makes the logistics of forward defense much easier. And it's a super project. And it's even more important if you think about how it really connects with other things. So now we understand the importance of a free and open Black Sea, building up the capacity of the littoral powers in the Black Sea to be able to make sure that there's freedom of the sea and that transit can go through. And again, Ukraine war demonstrated that's eminently doable. And the Black Sea is critical because it really is a connecting node of vast importance. Because if you have a free and open Black Sea and you have a 3 Cs initiative, you can connect that to the middle corridor. And the middle corridor is no longer about connecting China to the west. It's about connecting Central Asia to the west. And so you have the Central Asia and the Caucasus. That route brings in energy. It brings in new sources of other resources, new opportunities for manufacturing, markets. And so you connect the middle corridor to the Black Sea, to the 3 Cs initiative. That takes you into the Mediterranean and connects to the Middle East. So we have these projects about expanding the capacity of the throughput for the Middle East. That connects you to Japan and South Korea and Taiwan and India, and really opens up the aperture of the amount of resources that can move through the Indian Ocean and connect through the Middle East into Central Europe, in Northern Europe, into Central Asia. And it also gets you into the Med, and it creates a new opportunity for Europe and the Middle East and our partners in Asia and the U.S. to work together in engaging with North Africa and East Africa and West Africa. So this is an important project because not only does it essentially recreate the normal geopolitical connectivity of Eurasia that's existed in all of history, except, because during the Cold War and now. But the other thing is, if you're just a geopolitical guy like me, is if you connect all those things, what does it do? It takes away all the space for the Chinese and the Iranians and the Russians to meddle, and it pushes Russia and China and Iran further apart.
Coming back to Halford Mackinder, the heartland would be.
I grew up in an age where, talking about Mackinder was like talking about Pliny or Aristotle, right? This is like ancient things that, you would laugh at. But the reality is what Mackinder was describing was kind of the natural geography of the world, which was disrupted by World War II, World War I, World War II, and the rise of the Soviet Union. And, geography matters, right? There are natural paths of connectivity. And we have the opportunity to recreate those. And what's important about it is not just, that we're making, royalties from Mackinder's books, but more importantly, it's if you think about that, if you look across that whole band, what do you have? You have little, small, and medium-sized countries, which for most of their history, of anybody alive in those countries, they never had an opportunity to make choices for themselves about how to deal with their future, their neighbors. They were always had one choice, or for either not given a choice, or they had to choose. You want to be in one sphere, or you want to be in the other. And this is not about creating new spheres of influence. This is about allowing nations to decide for themselves how they want to do business and who they want to do business and who they want to connect with. It's not about deploying divisions. It's not about masses of foreign aid. It's about letting people decide for themselves and their future. I think it's the most empowering thing for humanity, really, in modern history.
Coming back to Ukraine and to the current state of affairs, Very short question. What do you make of recent Macron's initiatives and his change in his rhetoric and sort of a new boost of French initiative?
Sure, yeah. This is off the record, right? This is not for attribution, right? This is podcast. Nobody's going to hear it, right? It's a joke. French foreign policy is a joke.
Yeah.
France is a joke.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're the Parthenon, the people that are dead, and they're humiliated. If somebody could move their dust and bones, they would do that.
Yeah.
This is a country that has zero influence in North Africa after essentially being the great power and influence. I mean, the notion for a country that can't even deal with terrorists in the Sahel, that France is going to lead us to the light in dealing with Russia is laughable. And I don't think Macron's relevant, quite honestly.
Okay, the next relevant question, and that we talk a lot both in Lithuania and EU, is about the sort of a military industry, both in EU and worldwide. So we see the current really grave situation in the European countries when the South Korea produces more shells than the whole
EU combined.
Right,
EU combined. So since you're a person from the military, more or less, what would be your evaluation of the current, of what was being called the military-industrial complex, right, in the US, and whether there is a sort of a need a boost in the US both, and what would be your recommendations for countries like ours and for the European capitals, if any?
Well, look, the difference between us and the Chinese and the Russians is our defense industrial bases are basically based on a free market. If there's no demand,
quite right, yeah.
There's no industrial base. If there's a demand, there'll be an industrial base. So if there was sustained demand from countries like there should be, I think there is every opportunity to build a very, very robust transatlantic industrial base that can respond to that. And I think we're already seeing signs of that. A lot of initiatives in Hungary about arms production, Bulgaria, tremendous opportunity to build a very serious defense industrial base in Ukraine, which Ukraine is going to have to do for its own security in the future. And then I think Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia bring a lot of really important niche capabilities. And if you integrate that with potentially the defense industrial base in Ukraine and Poland and Bulgaria and Hungary, it could actually be quite substantial. So I'm the optimist here, but it doesn't need an EU industrial policy, which actually would probably make things a lot worse. It doesn't need an EU army, which would probably make things a lot worse. What it needs is one simple thing. Nations put the demand out there for the arms and munitions that they legitimately need for their own defense purposes. And I think the West will build an industrial base that responds to that.
I'm glad that you're so optimistic. We don't have that much of optimism in our public discourse at these days. Well, the other sort of elephant in the room, if I may say, is the upcoming election period in both in EU, of course, but the most important, of course, is the November's election in the US. What are your thoughts? Do we really need to, as the regular Lithuanians, worry about the possible changes in the Washington's posture towards the traditional allies, towards NATO's commitments? What would be your take?
And again, not being political.
Yes,
and I think if we assume, which I think is pretty obvious at this point, that it's going to be either Trump or Biden, I'll be brutally honest. I think Trump would be way better for Europe than Biden. Biden's heart is not in Europe and in the defense of Europe. And, we had a good example of that. Biden was really serious about Ukraine and the defense of Europe. One, he would have been much more aggressive in pushing aid. The other was he would have made a very sincere effort for bipartisan leadership. When World War II broke out, the first thing President Roosevelt did, he didn't invade Normandy. He didn't attack the Japanese. He went to Congress and he said, we're going to do this together. And all the politics of the New Deal of right versus left, that was all put aside. The most important thing that he wanted was that Republicans and Democrats put this because this was important. Joe Biden did exactly the opposite. Not only did he not really push for bipartisan consensus in dealing with Ukraine, he actually did Ukraine in a way to drive a wedge between Republicans and exploit that. I mean, if you look at every package he put on the table, yeah, there was money for Ukraine, but then there was a bunch of money for a lot of stuff that had nothing to do with Ukraine and which Republicans absolutely hated and has driven the deficits through the roof. He's made it very, very hard for Republicans to be supportive by demanding, tying to it policies which are absolutely an anathema to Republicans, including border and immigration security. And when Republicans tried to hold, let's be honest, tried to hold aid for Ukraine and Israel hostage to border security, what did Biden do? He actually put in worse plans for the border. Like he put a border deal, but it's actually just to actually make it spend more money about importing illegal immigrants. And essentially he was throwing Ukraine and Israel under the bus. So I think this administration will essentially do whatever Berlin wants. And if Berlin says, let's just force the Ukrainians to cut a deal, I think that's what Biden will do. The contrast is I think Trump will be good. You know, people say Trump wants to pull out of NATO, which is probably the most nonsensical charge I've ever heard. I worked on the Trump transition because it's a nonpartisan activity, the actual presidential transition. There was never a plan to pull out of NATO. I worked with the administration for 4 years. There was never a plan to pull out of NATO. I know what their plans are if they had gotten reelected. There was no plan to pull out of NATO. I know the people that work around Trump, there is no plan to pull out of NATO. There's never been a plan to pull out of NATO. Matter of fact, Trump's actually very proud of pushing NATO to be more defensive. He was the first American leader to stand up and push for Norway and Sweden to join NATO. There would not be a Ukraine today if it wasn't for Donald Trump, because during the 4 years of his presidency, he pushed for the critical munitions that they needed for the front line of defense, for the javelins. And more importantly, he really opened up the aperture for the U.S. to do coordinated defense planning with the Ukrainians. So the reason why the Ukrainians survived the first battle was because of Donald Trump. So this notion that somehow Trump's going to abandon these people is just wrong. What Trump will do is he will push NATO to do the things that NATO needs to do to ensure that we do not go to bed at night worried about who's Russia's next target. And if I were Europe, I think the left will tell you, and the European elites will tell you, we have to defend ourselves against Trump. And that's exactly the wrong thing to do. Have a positive, constructive relation. I talk to people in Ukraine who are basically told by the U.S. administration that, we got this, the Republicans are the problem, Donald Trump is your enemy. These are political. These aren't foreign policy analysis that actually care about what's going around. Biden's foreign policy is driven by one thing: what's good for Biden's politics. It's not what's good for the United States or what's good for Europe. So I'm actually, pretty optimistic that you would get a way better partner from the United States from a Trump presidency than you would from a Biden presidency.
Yeah. The one thing what needs to be clarified is that why these kind of words are one part, of course, the discourse from the left right. about Trump presidency, but the other thing is that, and I think Laurynas would agree with me, is the sort of a disconnection between the Trump rhetoric and Trump action. Right. Because there are things that are really worrying about the Trump rhetoric, right. And you would agree with me on that point.
Look, and I think you just nailed it. It's a double whammy. On the one hand, it's this incredible effort to demonize Trump by elites. And, we just had this thing, for example, with the bloodbath comment. I don't know if this is a big thing here. So in the U.S., President Trump on the campaign trail said, if Biden's reelected, it'll be a bloodbath for American auto companies. And the media campaign within minutes after the speech was, President Trump says there'll be a bloodbath if Biden wins the election, as somehow that this was going to cause a civil war. It was a complete and utter distortion. So on the one hand, this is kind of the crazy rhetoric. And the other hand, it's kind of, Trump's personality and how he does things. Look, that's how he's spoken his entire life. Actually, the one thing I've always admired, and I've met President Trump several times, and he's the same guy in private that he is in public. That's his personality. It's not going to change. He's always talked that way. He doesn't sound like, Roosevelt or Ronald Reagan, but strategic leadership is rhetoric and action. And you have to put them in context. If you put Trump's rhetoric in context, it actually does make sense. If you pair it with his action, it makes perfect sense. And so I would say, and this is actually why Trump is so effective with the Russians and the Chinese and the Iranians. Because what do the Russians, the Chinese, and Iranians have in common? They pay attention to what we do. They don't pay attention to what we say. And they fear Donald Trump because of what he'll do, because he'll stand up to them. So you can obsess about the hair and the tweeting and everything else, or you can focus on what the United States actually does, which has actually been pretty. Remember, it was Donald Trump who said Nord Stream 2 is a really bad idea. It was Donald Trump who said the INF Treaty is a joke because Russia is an aggressor here. So, it was Donald Trump who said we need to spend more on defense because we don't have enough to defend ourselves. In retrospect, we can look back and say, okay, we all hated him when he yelled at us about these things, but the reality is he was right about all of them.
Well, I don't think there are many fans, especially in Central Eastern Europe, of the Obama administration that basically abandoned us, and a lot of the initiatives that were started on defense radars and anti-missile initiatives, they were basically put off the table.
Even Europeans forget this, right? If you look at the rhetoric of Europeans at the end of the Obama administration, is actually quite negative. They gave him a Nobel Prize, but they were disappointed every point of the way. And every year they were more disappointed than they were the year before.
Well, I think we would agree that the Nobel Peace Prize is the most irrelevant
prize you can get, especially having... Well, I think there is European fault, for example, what happened in Syria, but there were red lines drawn and they were not kept. And that created part of the migrant crisis problem of refugees.
He failed you in Syria. Yeah. He failed you in Ukraine.
Well, yes, we remember all those in 2014 when John McCain at that time rooted for the Obama administration to give javelins and stingers at that time already to Ukrainians. Of course, they were... No. Well, yeah. Ukraine was rather different at that time, but still, we said that the same, our political establishment.
And Biden came in and he failed you in Afghanistan. I mean, the Europeans went to Afghanistan for one reason, because the Americans were there. Yeah. And they went to it out of solidarity with the Americans. There were countries that went to Afghanistan that were not even in NATO, but they wanted to prove to the Americans that they were reliable partners. So they went with us in Afghanistan, and they fought and they died to show solidarity with us. And Joe Biden walked out the door and didn't even tell them he was leaving.
Okay, so I think we should wrap it up, our conversation. In the last question, we are here in the 2024 March. We have, as Lithuania, as our government, we have a lot of issues. We have a lot of challenges. We are starting to implement a really ambitious defense strategy. Well, looking at the world and looking from Washington, looking from Vilnius, what would be your sort of strategic recommendations for Lithuania's government at this point, state of affairs?
Well, America's a 50-50 country. I don't know who's going to win. And I do think you have to have two different plans. You have to have a plan if Trump wins and a plan if Biden wins. I like American interests are there's more continuity than change. The United States is not going to abandon Europe, whether a Republican president or a Democratic president is elected. I really believe that because it's a vital interest for us to have a stable Europe. Having said that, I think their approaches will be very, very different. And I think you have to plan you have to survive in the world that you're in. So you have to think really deeply about what each president's going to do if they're elected in future foreign policy. And the other thing is, and you guys know this because you're dealing with Taiwan and China, right? It's not just... What affects them is not just what their plan is and what they're going to do in Europe. What are they going to do in Africa? What are they going to do in the Middle East? What are they going to do in Asia? That's going to affect you too, and you have to think about that.
Okay. Thank you very much. I just want to remind our dear listeners that we've been talking to James Carafano, Senior Counselor to the President and E.W. Richardson Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. You've been listening to the Right Mind podcast. Thank you.
Thanks.